Let's hear your input.
So what?
Let's hear your input.
Okay, so, goodness.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Can I ask you a question to maybe help me understand?
Well, before you do, just know that when Urban asks me a question like that, he knows what's in here, and I could talk all day, so it's hard for me to narrow it down. So go ahead, Jackie.
Well, I just want to pose this question because I'm also on the timeline, and I want to hear your perspective. Right. Because Irvin and I were talking, and we were speaking in terms of education, and so you know, when K through 12. My experience and my understanding based on the conversations that I have had, that still is not where it should be.
Yeah.
So you see more of that, yes, in the higher education, because you know, you got more freedom to explore those really hard issues and learn. But I want to be corrected if I'm incorrect in that, because maybe I'm just talking to the wrong people, or I should expand my conversation to other people. But as I see it as a person, as a woman of color, as a mother, as a grandmother, you know, I don't see it too much different than when I was coming up.
Yeah. Well, what I would say is, number one, it is different from when you were coming up. There's more information than when you were coming up. There are more situations where Black history is being talked about, where the contributions of Black Americans are being talked about. The problem is, and so yes, I think there is more. There's this emphasis, you know, hey, it's Black History Month, we got to do something, you know. Hey, we're approaching our Black history part of the curriculum or whatever. But I think, at least in my experience, and I can't speak for the whole country because, you know, I'll have students, you know, I teach at a small community college in Alabama, and I'll have students who come to me from other places who I can tell they got a better, they got taught better. They got more, not just more information, but how to look at it critically, how to see how it applies today. I have seen that in some students, okay? So I don't have a good way to look at it and say, hey, it's better, it's worse. I just know that where I live, where I teach, and it's sad because I have, especially at the Eufaula campus where I teach, there's so many Black students there that come to me and sit in my class for the first time. And when they hear me on a college level, freshman level, teaching Black history, teaching American history, and when I'm focusing on Black history topics, they're saying, I've never heard this before, or why didn't our teachers talk about this? Or they might even say, and this really gets to the point, we tried to talk about this in Miss So-and-so's class, but she didn't want to. She changed the subject. It's because it's a difficult conversation. And most, just be honest with you, from what I've seen, what I've experienced, most white teachers are scared to death. It's just my perspective, and I could be wrong, but a lot of white teachers are scared to have that conversation, especially if the student body is largely African American.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Riley, one of the things, we were discussing this morning, but I was telling her, because of revisionist history, then the history that I learned growing up in Oklahoma, and Danielle can testify to this, basically, you know, in the 70s and early 80s, a lot of the history books only reflected white history, but then we had to learn actually Oklahoma history. So we learned a lot about Native Americans. I remember, I don't know if you remember Mr. Jensen, but Mr. Jensen was one of my teachers, and hey, Oklahoma history. And so therefore, a lot of the Native Americans we learned.
Yep, we had the same.
As far as Black history, I didn't learn it. You know, if you went to Douglas in Oklahoma City, then yeah, because that's a large African American school basically. But in Shawnee, Oklahoma, at Shawnee High, no, I didn't learn any history. But revisionists have revised history books so that now it reflects African American contributions that occurred.
I didn't want to interrupt, but I was curious if Irvin had ever, since this is the anniversary of my old dog is barking at my young dog. Sorry. Since this is the anniversary of the race massacre in Tulsa, I was curious if Irvin remembered ever being taught that until he was an adult. Had we been taught that in our environment? Because we were at the
You know what? I don't think I ever heard anything about, Greenwood and Pine. That's, that area until my adult years. Actually, I didn't even know that they had dropped a bomb in America, on a particular community until later in life. I never learned that in Oklahoma history. And Tulsa, we grew up, what is it, an hour and a half, 2 hour drive, something like that, to Tulsa. So I didn't even know that. Even Gap Band, I don't know if you know my wife definitely loves some Gap Band, but Greenwood and Pine, that's really what those letters come from. You dropped a bomb on me, one of their songs that they sing. But
is that what
I never heard that.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that. I just learned something.
That's it, Greenwood and Pine. That's where Gap Band came from. That's the name. But no, I never heard about that. And so, massacre of all kinds of people that occurred there, is similar to a Rosewood down here in Florida. And a lot of people know about Rosewood. But one of the things that we want to do, let's see if we can turn the conversation. What do we do now? How do we engage this dialogue so that we don't drive people away, but draw them in to actually hear the message? And Riley, I'm gonna, you teach African American history, and let me tell you a little bit about Riley. Riley, I used to teach at Heritage Christian University, and one of the things that I had this wild idea to try to build a multi-ethnic church in Alabama. And a lot of people thought the idea was crazy, and I would communicate it to students when I was there at the college. And I remember this one little student from Birmingham. He went around and he was trying to say that Dr. J is they didn't call me Dr. J back then, but Dr. Jackson is racist, is what he was thinking. But individuals who knew me and interacted with me and what I was trying to do recognized that I wasn't. This guy here, Riley Turner, was preaching at another congregation, and he decided to invite me. He was a student in one of my classes. But anyway, he invited me to speak over at the congregation, East Colbert. And so I did, and it was about unity. That's what we were talking about. And somehow we kept communicating the vision of a multi-ethnic church. And this guy sat down and he penned a letter. He wrote a letter, and about what he believed the kingdom of God is supposed to be like and what the church is supposed to be like. And upon reading that letter, I went to the leadership. Hey, this is the guy. This is the guy that we need. And they were wondering financially, how are you going to do this, that, and the other? Say, hey, look, we can cut this off my salary. I still get this over at the college. Let's bring it. And so, and we struggled, but we brought him. We brought him over. And for 10 years, we worked together.
The recession hit in the middle of that.
Yeah, the recession really hurt us. It did. But anyway, and during the time, he was able to get his master's degree, and I think he got 2 master's degrees. Yeah. And during the time we worked together. And so he went and started working at Wallace State. And next thing you know, I remember he called me and said, guess what? I said, what? He says, they want me to go down to this area that's pretty much, largely African-American because of, his experience working, because our church was actually, it was African-American church. It was actually, the colored church of Sheffield at one point. And so anyway, he went into that area, and then next thing you know, now he's teaching Black African-American history. And, he has really, people have recognized his genuineness in what he's trying to do. So our question is how do we educate people? How do we get people to the point where they can hear the message, recognize that there are problems that really exist. They really are. But the question is how do we get people to the point where they hear and actually make a change? Riley, go for it.
Right. Well, if I may, Riley, excuse me, you forgive me because I'm on a timeline. So I
she has to get out too because she's at work, right?
I do, but I want to be able to add on as I finish up with this conversation with you is I guess that I'm in conflict. I really don't know what it's going to take. We've had discussions about we all need to come together as a community and have really some honest, hard discussions. We need to, talk about the systemic problems that are prevalent and they exist. I'm sorry. As I see it, as I know it, as I experience it, it exists. We need to, bring education to our children in the schools. Yeah, absolutely. Everybody agrees to that. How do we do that? So it's conflict because, again, as I started off this conversation, we've been here before. People, we've been here before. So I guess I don't have the answer. I don't know what it is because we've all said the same thing. So I guess my perspective at the end of the day, when everything is said and done, I think that what we really need is we need to bring God back into the conversation. We need to make sure that we understand those principles. And we need to stop thinking about right, left, red, blue, black, brown, white, yellow. I'm tired of all of that. I'm of one race. That's period. And although I come from a place where I empathize with my diverse brothers and sisters, Danny, I think you're my sister. It's like I'm looking in the mirror. All right? But let me tell you what the difference is between you and I, Danny. As soon as I open up my mouth, I cease to be you. As soon as I walk down the street with my husband that I love and I look at as a man who just so happens to have a different shade of skin than I am, I know it. So I face it. I see it. I see it. God bless my husband. He's like, he walks around, I love everybody. I don't see it. But I think he does.
I see it.
Because at that very moment, I'm trying to remember. I'm still, Riley, you forgive me. I'm still growing as a Christian. I'm angry.
Me too.
I get angry because how dare you judge me based on the accent in my voice and the person I choose to love? How dare you? So although I understand, and we all need to, we are the world. You see my background? That's not the reality. So how do we come to the table? I don't know. I wish I knew. I could only be a better person. I could only try to further my message along with love, and that I know that what guides me are godly principles, but I'm still learning and I still get upset and I still get angry. And I told Irvin, I said, I'm struggling between two things, between a hug and a brick. And that's being honest. And that's being honest. Because I knew where I came from and I knew that that's really, has it changed? Because I go back to those neighborhoods and I don't see any changes. And you can say, oh, well, it's systematic within that community. No, there's something broken. And it doesn't matter if you don't have enough money in the bank, if you don't have as much education as the next person. I am an individual just like you. And we all meet the same end, and that's the grave. So what do we leave behind? So I'm sorry for my soapbox, but as I exit, I just need to, to be able to share my thought as with many others, because there's many other people like me. There's many other people like me, and it is just not for my community. And I get it, and I thank that there are people like Danny that, even though look like me, don't have the same. Sorry, I don't know you, but I'm just making an assumption that we're women, and we probably felt oppression on that same level. But although you could empathize and sympathize with the movement, you have had an advantage that I have not. And that's my truth. And that's my truth. And there are many people that walk that same walk that I do. So I want to be able to be free to hug you, to hug my husband. And by the way, I do, because I don't care. It's cute like that. Okay? And so how do I make people see past that? I don't know. I don't know. But it's a world that I wish that I could see changing before my day comes, because the heaven that I know is waiting for me has none of that. And it almost makes me feel a sense of urgency to get there.
Okay.
So that's the question I leave. I love you all, especially that one right over there. But I thank you for indulging my part of my conversation. And I wish blessings upon you all. But I got to go.
Okay. Thank you for taking time. Jackie works for HCC, Hillsborough Community College, and she's working here in the home. Like I said, I'm in the garage. She's in her office, but she does have to get back to work. So I'm going to let you go. Thank you. And we're going to continue the discussion. Jackie, I'm going to log you out. There you go. And Riley, you know, like I said, you and I, we've spent hours talking, you know, we spent years talking about stuff like this simply because we work together to build a church that embraced diversity. And so, you know, if you were to just look at overall where we are right now, the things that are occurring, what's our course? What's our direction?
Well, I mean, I have the simple and quick answer is I have no earthly idea. Because I mean,
come on, man, you gotta know something.
I you know, but here's what here are the things that come to mind. I think education, and let me be very clear. When I say education, the first thing people's minds go to is, you know, school and classrooms and all that. And yes, I mean that, but I mean way more than that. Way more than that. And so the first thing I would say is to people who are already thinking along these lines, people who are already like, hey, you know, I want to make a difference. I see the problems. I want to be a part of the solution. What do I need to do? Okay, so on 3 levels, okay, the home, the classroom, and the church, okay? And those are the 3 areas where I think if you want, so let's just say we're talking about a young couple with small children, and they want to be a part of making a difference. In the home, teaching your children, you know, and that involves educating yourself first. Let's say you're interested in trying to be a part of the solution. You've got to educate yourself. Find folks who can send you in the right direction in terms of books, in terms of podcasts, in terms of lots of things to really become educated as to what actually took place in American history. Okay. Now, yeah, I don't think the history we taught was bad. What we were taught as kids was bad history. It just wasn't complete. We were taught a lot of good stuff. We were taught a lot of good facts. But that's part of the problem is that we were taught mostly facts. We weren't taught a lot about using critical thinking skills to understand the stories that we were reading.
Now, I'm going to challenge you on that one. See, the thing is the things that were left out affected the people who were marginalized.
Yeah.
In other words, who do we look up to? If we see all of the inventions and all the creations and all of the discoveries and everything is all by.
But just wait and let me finish.
Okay.
I was about to bring that into it. We were taught some good history. Notice I used the word some. We were taught some good history. A lot of things we were taught were good. But we weren't taught a complete story, okay? And so, yes, the things you just mentioned, a lot of that was left out. And then in addition to that, even with what we did have, very little critical thinking skills were required of us other than to memorize some stuff and regurgitate it. And what we were memorizing and regurgitating was usually most often incomplete. And so it left out a lot of the things that you're talking about, okay? So we would get a dumbed down version, okay, or a limited version of history, which you might even call. I mean, if you know, historians have often said that the winners write the history books. So if you want to, how do you want to define the winner? The dominant society, the one that controls. Anyway, so it starts, I think, if we're going to use my little illustration of a young couple raising little children who want to be a part of the solution, educate themselves first, and then educate their children, not just with what they teach them, but in like, for example, we used to take our children to various things. We would take our children to even when they were little, before they could fully comprehend, and we've done it at least once, maybe twice, we'd take our children to the Birmingham Civil Rights Museum. And walk them through that so that they could, that early on in their formative years, they begin to see that kind of thing. We took our, there was a Ku Klux Klan rally in Tuscumbia, the sister city of Sheffield, in 2007. And we heard that there were going to be protests, that there were folks from different churches who were going to go and protest that Klan rally. We went to it. We took our children. We kind of had them stay at a distance from what was going on. But we went and protested that. We talked to our children about what are the guys in the pointy hats doing? What do they believe? In fact, I seem to remember Wilson asking that question. Why are the guys in the pointy hats mad or something like that? So it requires parents educating themselves, educating their children, and then also a part of that education involves getting to know people who are the other. Spending time with people who don't look like you, who don't, you know, finding ways to engage with people. School board meetings. What are they called? The teacher parent associations. Anyway, the parent teacher association meetings and things like that. Be involved with those things. Get involved with people of other backgrounds in those various settings. Find ways to gravitate toward them, because the norm, let's just say we had a PTA meeting up here at the school where our children go. We had a PTA meeting. You're going to have mostly white parents there, a few black parents, and for the most part, the white parents are not going to make a special effort to sit near the black. They're not going to try to shun them, but they're not going to try to make a special effort to get to know them. Make a special effort to get to know them. When your children get to know black children at school, and encourage those relationships.
So let me stop. So basically, you're talking about intentionality. You're saying that in order for certain things to happen, there has to be intentionality, and it has to come from the majority in order for it to occur. I'm going to tell you a story, and it has to do with Danielle's mom. See, one of the things that you are saying by telling the history the way that it was taught in the past, it creates a pathology in those who are neglected from being a part of that history, or if they're in that history, it's always in servile roles. And so what happens is it creates a pathology that we're not the winners. It creates a pathology that we're nobody. But then there's this area where we do, we fit. I remember I was in select choir, and the first thing is they made me sing at this high octave, which was not my natural voice, simply because I had the name Jackson, and Michael Jackson was so I'm singing at this high, and I remember, whatever. Anyway, so I remember one time, I think it was the 7th or 8th grade, somehow, okay, and the garage door is opening and my stepdaughter is pulling up. But anyway, somehow what happened is I was invited over to one of my teacher's houses. Her name was Miss Willis. And several of the students, even black, we went over there and we were interacting, and she had a piano up in her front room. Well, I had a piano in the back of our house that I used to mess around with all the time. And I went and sat down at that piano, and I started playing some, what little bit I could play. And I remember her mother walking up to me, and she saw me playing there, and she looked at my fingers, and she made a statement to me about how much talent that I had lying within me and potential that I had. And when she said that, she don't know what she really did. See, because I grew up in an environment where we weren't validated by I was the minority, and we didn't have that validation. We haven't been validated in what we're learning. We haven't been. And so what happened is I read that statement that she made as a validation of me having potential to be able to become somebody great. And so, that was really, it was, every time I talk to her, I thank her for that statement that she made to me, simply because it did something to my psyche where I was validated by somebody other than. And so now another thing that you made a statement is getting to know and connect with people. One of the things that I noticed is that most people, we were talking about it just earlier this week, how a lot of people have their in group. They have these, if you were to look at their Facebooks, look at the last 9 friends, usually Facebook will show you that they've made connections with, and usually they're always the same ethnic makeup, ethnic persuasion as the person that you're looking at. If you were to look at, let's say I work in a college environment, so if you look at mine's pretty diverse. But then I'm aware of it, and because I'm aware of it, so it's intentional. So intentional, recognizing where some people are. Some people are dealing with pathologies that they haven't climbed out of as a result of white privilege, and somehow we need to be aware of those things.
Okay, so. And I agree. Let me just go back to what you said about it. Going back to what I said. So education in the home with parents and children, educating themselves, teaching their children, not just through verbal communication, but when you go to the you're at Walmart and you go and you're choosing a line to go through. Choose to go through the black ladies line or the Hispanic ladies line if you have a choice. So your children interact with that person, okay? So anyway, intentionality in the home, number one. Number two, in the school. People have got to get engaged with changing the conversation in the schools. There begins to need to be an expectation in the schools that history is, and I'm not saying that history is not being taught, and I'm not saying that black history is not being taught. I'm saying that it's surfacey. Okay, and I know, and we know this to be true even with education in the church. You can't get into some of the intricacies and depths of what was going on with David and Bathsheba and all that, or Rahab, with second graders. Okay, you can go so far with that, but surely by the time they're 15, 16, 17. You're able to get to that depth. It doesn't need to wait till they're in their mid to late 20s before that depth is approached. They can deal with that in their mid to late teens. So from looking at it from a biblical perspective, okay, same is true of black history in the schools. They need to have those difficult conversations, okay? And I think the reason it doesn't happen, number one, is because a lot of high school teachers are not educated as they should be, and to the depth that they should be, to be able to have the conversation. Secondly, I believe they're scared sometimes to have the conversation for fear that they can't control the conversation, that they can't moderate, and that it's going to turn in a negative way, and that they're going to get in trouble, and there's going to be blowback, and parents are going to be mad. So I think that's part of what's going on. So something needs to change at the school level. And then the third area is the church. And Jackie said it. I believe that all of this conversation that we're having doesn't matter if it is not bathed in a biblical, scriptural, Christian perspective, a Christ-centered perspective. And we've said this forever. We've been saying this for years. It is not my Anglocentricity or your Afrocentricity or whatever. No, we're to be Christocentric. We're to be centered on Christ. And in the end, that is what will matter. And if that is not a part of the conversation, we are only touching the hem of the garment. when we
Let
talk
me
about
bring,
education, when we talk about what we can do in the home. But if it's not based in a Christ-centered perspective, I think we will never, and I do believe this, we will never fully achieve the unity that we need merely through secular means.
okay, Danielle comes to my mind again. And, Danielle, you made a statement that you didn't want your children, you didn't want that prejudice to pass on to your children. And so therefore, you evidently, you're aware of how they're educated. You're aware of their interactions. You're aware of their influences. But again, okay, Danielle comes from a very conservative background. That's her origin. And a lot of times, I'll be honest, some of the privilege that we experience is a lot of times very much connected with. In fact, my wife and I were watching Tim Wise, who is a white activist, but very, very powerful when it comes to explaining white privilege. And but okay, Danielle, you were raised up in a conservative home, and I made a statement about a positive, but then a lot of times you have some people who become very silent, during issues like this. And a lot of times, look at, the president at the time and the way that he's handling it, a lot of times is creating a greater rift than it is bringing people together. And I'm just wondering, what is your perspective about people who have maybe a conservative stance, but yet it's like, I don't know, do they not see what's really going on? Or and I guess I'm having a hard time trying to figure out how to articulate the question, but I feel the way you're looking, you kind of know what.
Well, I have an opinion. Well, first let me say that I have a son who's stationed in the military in the 3rd Infantry in Washington, D.C. And when a president calls for the military to stand against American citizens over an issue that he feels, where he wasn't outraged when they were in my own community, people were walking around with machine guns because they had to wear a face mask. And so the fact that this situation's come up, and my son, who was raised to see, because we had Sister Young's church, because we had a community that there were people in it that my children could see black faces and white faces together at a very young age. Now the president's asking my son to pull a gun on another American. That's where I'm getting involved emotionally, and it breaks my heart, because he will hold the Bible in front of a camera, and that is not Christian. You can tell me whatever you want to about Christ, but that's just a name until it gets poured out into an action. God is just a metaphor. God is just an analogy. God is just made up to people until they see him in action. And if the action is to validate some martial law that you're throwing around the name of God, you better be careful about how you use in the name of God. And I get really involved in that area because I was raised in this, and I still see almost a resurgence of whiteness in this community.
Danny, it's like it's using God as a nationalism symbol. It's using church as a nationalism symbol. It's basically stealing the name of Christ and God to promote a very intense nationalism. And most people don't really understand what nationalism is. It's basically the idea of promoting one's own country as being above and better than all other countries in the world, to the extent that it's one thing to say, I love my country and I'm going to defend my country. I was in the military. I have no problem with that. But nationalism takes it to the extreme that says that my particular cultural views of what my nation is the right cultural views, and any other cultural view is not right, and therefore you are the other and you are excluded. And
it's
so
chosen nation. It's the chosen nation concept.
Right.
Yeah.
And so what it does, it excludes others and their ideas, and takes God, and you throw God in the mix to define your thing, and so you end up with this justification because God is on my side. And that really, if you look at it from a political point of view, from a historical political point of view, all nations have done that and have created awful havoc throughout the world by saying that either God is on my side in this unbiblical overthrow of a people or a nation or a culture, or I am God. And you saw that with the Roman emperors. You saw that with the Japanese Hirohito and North Korea's Kim Jong-un. I think we see that in a sense in what is happening right now with the current situation.
Yeah.
And I think what was done yesterday was shameful. What our current president did yesterday was shameful, and was a good example of what I'm talking about.
I agree. I use the expression hijack church. We're so willing to somehow embed this idea of a patriot religion. It's not Christianity, it's patriot religion. Somehow mix that up together all into whiteness. It is a color thing. And I want to point out that I wasn't taught Native American history to the degree that it should have been, since this was the place that we death marched all the Indians to. Let's be honest. Mm-hmm. So there's so many things that we have to overcome, and it does require getting out of our comfort zone, and it does require me saying, okay, I am the white lady. You can it's okay for you to say or feel that way, because that oppression, that feeling, that history, those generational trauma is real.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I acknowledge that trauma still affects children's education, still affects children's way they see themselves, still affects so many things that we have to, as an entitled person, be able to say, yeah, they're mad. Let them be mad for a minute.
So my question is how do you get people who are blind to even see it? Because it seems like they're blinded to it.
I think two things. I want to go back to something Danny said, and then I want to come back to white privilege. Okay, she mentioned, and we all three were nodding our heads about generational trauma. Is that's got to be understood. Is generational trauma has to be understood, and that's what I'm finding more and more is that most white people, at least in my experience, and even some black people, don't understand the idea of generational trauma. But not just generational trauma. You can see, we could take the word trauma out and put a lot of other words in about what happens over the course of generations, given this political situation or given that particular situation or whatever's going on, how generationally situations are created, okay? And if they're not dealt with appropriately, then it creates problems, it creates trouble, it creates pain. Okay, so
there's a professor that says that most black people have PTSD because during all the trauma that has occurred, no counseling has been given. They always just had to deal with it. And so therefore it's just passed down from generation to generation. It just made sense to me.
But it's not just
seeing people,
Yeah, but it's not just that generational trauma. I mean, you have to think about this too. Remember, when you talk about the history of slaves and slave masters, they also say that slave masters probably had PTSD. And the reason for that is you can't be a part of that kind of violence for long and that kind of a situation for long without impacting you, and how it was detrimental to the slave owner, and particularly the slave managers, the crackers, the whip crackers.
Yeah.
that it traumatized them as well and had an impact on their psyche for generations. Okay. And so if you look at that down the road, then you get to a position where, now let's get back to what you said about white privilege. Here's what I think part of the problem is with that situation. You want to know, how do we change that? How do we get people to see these things? And I think much of it has to do with semantics. Much of it has to do with words. Because I can tell you, and being honest, being completely honest, when I hear the phrase white privilege, it makes me angry because I don't like it.
Yeah.
Phrase is wrong. I think now the idea behind white privilege, the concept, I think can be explained. It's saying my internet connection is unstable. I think it can be explained in a way where a thinking, rational person, without using the phrase white privilege, can go, okay, I can see that. But I think when that's thrown out, it's almost like a not a dog whistle, but it's something that when you hear it, just makes you cringe if you're a white person. Okay.
Let me make this statement to Danielle. Yesterday, Riley and I wrote a note on Facebook, and I called it the miseducation of the white man. Actually, I think I changed it and called it the re-education of the white man. But anyway, Riley, he like I said, we always check each other because we had to work at a church that we were trying to get to be multi-ethnic. So we were always checking each other. And he let me know that some people would look at that and automatically cut it off. They wouldn't even read it. Even though the argument, all I said is one of the failures of civil rights is the legal aspect was taken care of, but the educational aspect wasn't. People weren't re-educated. And so what happened is those same values just continue. And so therefore, they translated into people's, instead of being explicit, they just became implicit. They were already implicit, but they just remained. And so therefore, education needed to occur. Education needed to occur to help people to change from their social Darwinistic types of perspectives. And so I wrote an article about it the other day and put it on Facebook. But he's right. Some people are not going to listen to it simply because of the semantics, because of the words that I used.
Well, and I was just reading an article written by my cousin Barclay Keith, who wrote that book that we were talking about the other day, and it's a good example of how if he had, the article was from the Atlantic. I can't. It has to do with, the details are too involved, but anyway. When I read the title, I thought, well, that sounds really boring and I'm not sure I'm interested. But my cousin posted it, so I'll read it. And I got about 6 paragraphs in and I was still bored. And then all of a sudden, boom, the hook came and it pulled me in. The original words did nothing for me. In fact, kind of turned me off a little bit. But when I got into the conversation, I was like, yes, this is good. And so I think a lot of times that's we've got to figure out ways, if we're going to change hearts and minds, we can scare them off quickly by using the wrong words right up front. That just
I was so intent with connecting with the book, The Miseducation of the Negro. Yeah. That's why I use that terminology.
Yeah, and for scholars, that's great because that makes us all go, okay.
I tend to write on. Sometimes I use a lot of scholarly words sometimes.
But if we're working to talk to everyday folks, that's,
break it down.
That's just my
opinion. I have to say that there's a verse that I use, and I was raised with my mom, and she was she was a very outspoken, empowered white woman. And so I had that, I knew that, I saw that right away. But to say that love is not easily offended. And if we're as the body of Christ, we got to be able to get around those things. I have been in the luxury of being at a very young age, not caring so much about what the church thought. And at about 17, I was a single mom in the Southern Baptist Church, and I carried my baby to full term rather than tell my parents. So that creates quite a bit of a strain. in you. And also the environment that was all about was appearance. I knew that my mom couldn't handle people knowing that she knew about this unborn child. And that could have possibly put me at a risk for life. And that's a real thing, and I don't apologize for saying it. So we as Christians, when we're talking about all the different things that appearances matter, we can't care if people are offended. Because if there was a man holding a little child's head under the water, my first reflex would probably be to kick the man and save the child. You know, I would understand that there's no point in trying to fight underwater with this baby. So I think that there's some discomfort that will take place, that has already taken place among white people. But think about how many generations, 500 years of discomfort that other people have had to feel. And it's
Right.
a different scale entirely.
Yeah, and I see your point, Danny. I see your point completely. You look at, you know, if you look at it comparatively, but then what is our goal? Is our goal to bring about change on a massive scale? And I think we would all say yes. If we want to see change. I would love to be, you know, in my 90s in a nursing home watching TV and sit there for, you know, 5 years and not see anything like George Floyd and all that stuff, and to see that things have changed radically. I would love to see that. If we're to see change happen on a massive scale, we have to be wise about how we do it. What's the scripture? Wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Okay. And so there's a way to go about it. And no, I'm not worried about whether I'm hurting anybody's feelings or not, because Urban knows I will call something what it is very quickly. But at the same time, I have to consider, what is my ultimate goal? If my ultimate goal is to bring about massive change, I got to find these inroads to get to someone's heart. If I start on the outset going, you've got privilege, you're white, you've got privilege, and you need to learn to accept that, and you need to change, and you need to humble yourself. Imagine if I changed the tone and I said, you're a sinner and you're bad and you're going to hell and you need to get right with Jesus. Well, what does that do a lot of times? It turns people off.
Well, I feel like you need my answers to my mama now.
Check this out. Now, the guy that I was telling you, I actually had invited him. But what's going on is he's so focused on all of the violence that's occurring. First of all, he puts these statistics up showing that white people are murdered by the police more than black people. It shows, let's say, like in 2017, about 400 and something white people, about 200 and something black people, and about maybe another 100 and something that were Hispanic. So, and it was consistent with that, you know, and he put it up there. Well, I went back and on his post, I put the numbers together and showed that out of a 72% population, you have 40-something% who are murdered by, but out of a, I forgot what I said. Anyway, it was totally disproportionate. If you look at the people of color as opposed to that, over 50% of those people murdered were people of color. And so I put that on there. And so what he was trying to do is negate because of the violence, he's trying to negate the issue. He said, this is not about racism, it's this, that, and the other. And so I kind of wanted to dialogue with him to, help him not deny that there's an issue, simply because, and that's the problem with the violence. The violence is causing people to be able to negate that there's really a problem that's creating the violence. And so that's the argument that I see a lot of people are doing. So therefore, they're not willing to be educated. It's hard to educate them simply because they're looking at what I think the enemy is using to cause individuals not to be able to dialogue like we're doing.
Common ground is one of the things that I think is so important, is if you can establish with someone in that relationship common ground. I mean, if you think about it, Urban, well, what is it that brought you and me together? I mean, if I had, No, I was not some blatant screaming racist or anything, not even anything close to that before I met you.
But I
But
appreciate the fact that you've acknowledged before the church that you did have prejudices.
yeah,
You were prejudiced.
right.
That was
But
your honesty is what really helped you to be received actually by the church.
but again, think about that. Where was I taught to be honest in the church? Where was I taught? The common ground that you and I started with was we believed in Jesus, we believed
Yeah.
in Christ, and we believed He was the answer for the world. And that, so common ground. And whether we're starting with that, or if you're just having a conversation with somebody and you find some form of common ground, that's the starting place.
Yeah.
You know, if we immediately come out and go and we're like this to begin with, instead of just going, hey, let's find what do we have in common?
Give me water from the well.